All right. Welcome to Five Major Mistakes That Block Small Businesses from Winning Big Contracts. I am your facilitator, Paul Wilson Jr., founder and CEO of Paul Wilson Global Solutions. And I'm excited to be with you here today for this session because I believe it's timely. I believe it's critical, and I believe it's important. So you're in the right place if you are a B2B business in terms of you sell to large corporations. The other person, right, or type of business that is right on timely for this session is if you're in B2G contracting, you sell to government agencies, right? So that's the two types of organizations I'm talking to today. Of course, any of you who are here, well, I want to welcome you here and hope you enjoy and get something out of this. But again, particularly if you are a B2B company or a B2G company. So let's jump in. For those who don't know, I've spent 20 years, probably plus, in supplier diversity and supplier development and supplier readiness, working with large corporations, running my own consulting firm, working with nonprofits in terms of running supplier development and supplier readiness programs. So I've seen it all the way from in such a wide spectrum. And I've been engaging with small businesses who are navigating that procurement and supply chain space again for over 20 years, but also designing solutions to help those businesses move forward and actually be able to acquire contracts. And so I've had the privilege and honor really of working with over 1,500 businesses. And over that time, it's seen more than $150 million of contract revenue. And again, and that's from businesses that are navigating that space with corporations as well as with government. So I can definitely say I've seen it all, done it all, small contracts, big contracts. I've gotten my own contracts, right? So I've worked with corporations in that respect. But what I'm most excited about, because I think when we talk about small business growth, what not is was only attached to it how much revenue they got, but actually the jobs that they were able to create. And over 3,500 jobs at those businesses that I've engaged with, right, which I think is critically important, right, because we know small businesses are the economic engine, right, of our economy and of our society. And so we're critical job creators. And really, when we look at access to contracts, which I believe is just as critical as access to capital. We talk a lot about access to capital and how small, and in particular, minority-owned and women-owned businesses have been able to access such a small percentage of venture capital, and that number is focused on, and that needs to be fixed. I think that needs to be changed. But I think something else that needs even more emphasis, if you will, right, are access to contracts, right? And because our research really tells us that anywhere between 150 to $150,000 of revenue growth or increase actually relates to a job that's created. So you imagine $100,000 contract that, let's say, is a $1 million contract. That's potentially 10 jobs that are created, right? And so I think it's critical, right? Because contracts, they create that predictable cash flow. And sometimes, especially if you have a 1, 2, or 3 year contract that you're able to lock in on, right? You're able to plan around that cash flow. And then it builds capacity. When we think about infrastructure, we think about people, all right, systems and processes, which are all critical to accelerating, right, that job growth and job creation. And again, it just allows a business, right? When you're able to build that contract revenue, right, over time, right, we're talking about potential generational wealth that can be created, sustainable businesses, profitable businesses that can be passed down to the next generation, if you will, or maybe somebody else that just even comes along and wants to buy that business. So for me, I'm passionate about access to contracts and how do we position our small businesses to actually get more of those contracts. The unfortunate thing, though, as wonderful as all of this sounds and as important as it is, our businesses are not ready. And that's what we're talking about today, the five mistakes that those businesses make. And it comes down to really two things why small businesses really struggle in this contracting space. One is lack of readiness, right? And it's not necessarily a lack of talent, it's not a lack of skill, not a lack of innovation, not a lack of ideas, right? Not a lack of hustle and passion. All that is in place, but usually it's not ready for the opportunities that are being made available again through corporations and government agencies. And so that's where the rub is, right? That's where the challenge is, that most of those failures is not a lack of skill, it's a lack of readiness. right? And then readiness, right, is typically then not measured. Because if you ask a company, are you ready? Most will say yes. Oh, yeah, I'm ready, right? But if we had to start peeling back the layers, right, or looking in the books or at the operations, let's be honest, right? Most small businesses, in many cases, aren't ready. And even so, what are we even talking about when we say ready? We're going to dig into that a little bit because I think that's important too, that we can just say ready, but what are we really meaning? How do we break that down? And again, is it 100% not ready, or are there degrees of not readiness, especially if you separate your business into, 4 or 5 categories? You may actually be ready in 3 or 4, but it may be 1 or 2 that you're not ready in. But here's the thing, when we talk about readiness, we don't talk in enough detail. We don't talk in enough specificity to measure readiness so then we can prepare in those categories of readiness. Because again, if we don't, you can't measure, right? What you have to measure what matters, right? To just simplify that, we have to measure what matters. And I would say for the most part today, when it comes to readiness, we are not measuring what actually matters to businesses, right? What actually matters to buyers, what actually matters to decision makers on that corporate and government side. And so let's talk about the mistakes, right? And I've seen these directly being a buyer in the supply chain space, being a consultant with small businesses, navigating to get those contracts. I've been in the supply diversity space, right? Program design and development. And so these 5 mistakes that we're talking about not just comes from me, but industry research, right? But I can say I've seen a lot of these mistakes in person. So number one is weak capital infrastructure, right? And so capacity infrastructure. I'm sorry, not capital. We'll get to capital later. Weak capacity infrastructure, and because again, in the position that a buyer has, and in the mind of a buyer, they have to be able to trust the decisions that they're going to make. If they award you a contract, they award a small business the contract, right? Because if that small business doesn't do well, right, that could blow back on that buyer. So there's concern there that if we give this contract, do they have the capacity? Do they have the infrastructure? Basically, the systems, the processes, right? The workflows, the not even, I won't even say competencies, because oftentimes the competencies is there, but it is really that capacity, that infrastructure that's not in place. And so buyers have to be confident that you can deliver consistently, right? Because if you get a contract, again, the key is not just can you deliver one time, but can you deliver consistently on an ongoing basis? So without a strong capacity infrastructure, this is a big mistake that small businesses think they're ready for more, but if they haven't put the systems and the infrastructure and the processes internally in place, that's a major mistake to try to pursue a contract that you're not ready for. All right. So that's mistake number one. Mistake number two is poor financial readiness. I told you we're going to get to capital, right? And we just did poor financial readiness. And so a business that isn't able to, that doesn't have consistent cash flow, first of all, and then isn't able to manage it, right? Also, you can tell that they're going to be struggling in how they price their RFPs, how they price the responses, how they price their product or their service. And again, and that could be too high or too low, right? Because even if you're a buyer and you have a small business that comes in way lower than everybody else, that's a red flag, just as much as if, of course, if your prices are too high. Again, especially if you don't have a strong justification for it. And if you only are pricing guessing, right? Or your price points are based on, again, inefficient processes and system, or maybe even inefficient purchases that you're having to make and that translate over into higher prices. That again, that's a mistake and a challenge for a buyer that's just hard to get past if a small business doesn't have the financial readiness to compete right against other businesses that are more stable, right? And again, if you, to just get you in the mind of a buyer, and buyers will tell you, right, it's a trust factor. It's not just about do you have a great product or service. It's the trust factor of the business. The business is going to be sustainable. And here's another thing that's challenging, which it puts a small business in a tough spot, right? The net terms of a lot of corporations and even some government agencies are getting pushed out to 60, 90, 120, 150 days, right? Which is very challenging for any small business, right? But if you are not able to sustain your business for 120 days, right? How can a buyer trust that if they give you that contract sorry, jumped ahead. If they give you that contract, that you will be able to execute on that. And so that's something that you have to get that house in order, right? You have to make sure that your financial readiness, that you're healthier financially before pursuing certain size of contracts. All right. So then number three is a limited relationship pipeline. You have to understand that yes, while every organization, every agent, every entity, you do have to go online and insert your stuff into the portal, right? You do have to build these profiles, right? You do have to have your information, right, readily accessible to a buyer. But a buyer, for the most part, unless it's a low risk, low dollar item, they're not making decisions just based on typically a profile. Again, if you've been in business at any amount of time, you've heard the term know, like, and trust. That not only matters for consumers, that also matters for buyers, right? They have to get to know you, get to know your business, like what they see, be comfortable with it, and then trust that if they award you a contract, you can execute. So a lot of times the trust relate is personal, is interactive, it's engaging. It doesn't happen just with them looking at your website, right? Or them just looking at your profile in their portal. Are you able to go to the conference and meet them somewhere? Are you able to just engage with them and maybe potentially have a meeting set up? Be able to actually maybe do a tour of your facility where you can invite them out and they get to see firsthand how your business operates, right? Because the key here, trust is going to drive that selection. And again, maybe the low risk, the lower amount of that contract, that interaction doesn't matter much. But I guarantee you, the higher those dollar amounts to go, the more risk that's involved to the company of a particular contract. The more complicated or maybe complex or intricate the product or service is, trust that trust requirement goes up even higher, which means that you're going to have to get from behind your computer, right? You're going to have to not just use social media. And again, that's a starting point. That's a great entry point. But in terms of you actually building a strong, healthy, engaging relationship, you're going to require to get out maybe of your comfort zone. Some of you maybe feel real comfortable, so this may not be a big deal, but you do have to understand that they're looking at more than just what's on a static profile or a static website. Your relationship does matter. Now, again, you got to have a strong profile online, LinkedIn, website, and all those good things, but your personal relationship actually will come into play. And again, the higher value the contract is, and the more complex the purchase is, or the product or the service. All right, so we hit three mistakes so far in terms of not having a strong relationship pipeline. So mistake number four, an unclear value proposition, right? An unclear value proposition. So what does this mean? Some people oftentimes relate value to price, and we've already talked about price a little bit, but when we talk about value, we're ultimately talking about what is the impact, what are the outcomes, what are the measurable KPIs that you're actually going to benefit that company or that organization or that agency based on the product or service that you have. Oftentimes, small business owners, entrepreneurs, they get excited about what they do. They get excited about the offers that they make, right? They get excited about the product or service or the platform that they've created, and haven't taken enough time to go a little bit deeper to really talk about what is the ultimate impact on the company that you're having, right? What is the benefit ultimately, right, to the agency if they pick you, right? If they use your product or service. So being able to calculate some ROI, being able to talk about risk mitigation, being able to talk about other value drivers that are important to that company, which part of that goes back to research. As you research the company, what's important to them, right? What are their financial goals in the upcoming year? And even outside of financial, what are their maybe environmental goals? What are their product related goals? What are their customer related goals, right? Understanding really what drives them and what their goals are. How does your product or service actually fit into their goals? How do you help them accomplish their goals? That's what we're talking about value here, to be able to capture that, calculate that, and communicate that to a buyer. Um, in a proposal. Of course, wherever you're committed on a website, right, in your profile, those are all critical things so that now, yes, you may have a competitive price, so you may even have the lowest price. And here's the thing, you actually may have a higher price. But if you're able to deliver on the value and communicate that clearly, it could be worth it to a company or an agency to actually hire you, right? Based even with a higher price, but because they're getting incredible ROI. But if you're unable to communicate that, again, it's almost a widget versus the widget. They can just kind of pick either one and I don't say hope for the best, right? But maybe get the same result, right? Out of two competing opportunities if you haven't demonstrated that clear value. So that's a mistake that a lot of small business owners make that really keeps them from winning big contracts because they're not clear about the value that they bring, not just, hey, I got a great product or service, but here's how it's going to benefit you. And here's some things that we've been able to calculate and even benefit other organizations, right, when they implemented our solution. And then finally, mistake number 5 is no performance or compliance systems. And this actually gets back a little bit even to the value one, because if you have strong systems in place, whether it be compliance related, performance related, you're capturing KPIs, you're capturing metrics, it's then easier to calculate your ROI, right? It's then easy at that point to calculate the value that you bring to a government agency or to a corporation if they award you the contract. But you can't really communicate that value if you haven't captured it, right? And oftentimes small businesses kind of struggle as it relates to technology. And fortunately, these days, the cost of technology for one has come down, as well as AI. You can't do any presentation without talking about AI, but AI in terms of automating systems, capturing data. There's some really powerful tools out there that will allow you to do that, that allows you to kind of minimize the need for a major technology budget, right? Because I know that's a concern, right? You're a small business trying to manage those costs. But again, you need technology to help you capture the data, manage the data, and then make sure that you're in compliance with not just with data management, but oftentimes, right, you have to deliver reports to these companies or government agencies. And to be honest with you, you should do it proactively, not just when they wait for it. You want to be in advance of right any requests that come to be prepared. So but if your compliance and performance systems aren't strong, right, it's hard for you to do a great job in terms of communicating, right, the data and the information and the results, right, that you're getting. And so and again and that's being proactive, but let alone being compliant, right, from that standpoint. And so if the buyer is not confident that you have the systems in place to give them the information that they need. Because remember, oftentimes the buyer or even the person in operations who's receiving your product or service or working with you, right? They have to capture data and information and reports, and then they're reporting to someone else, right? So you have to think about that too. It's not just the person that you may be working with directly. It's also who they're reporting to and what they're responsible for. And so that's a major mistake for many small businesses who don't have those systems in place and then aren't able to turn around and produce what's required from those buyers. So those are all right critical factors from that standpoint. And so if we again just had to kind of summarize what the lack of readiness comes down to, oftentimes the lack of readiness really is a lack of awareness, right? Let's start there, right? And even this, one data point, it says 70% of small business are aware of federal contracting opportunities, but 50% don't know how to find specific bids, and then nearly 30% are completely unaware of contracting opportunities. And if that snapshot is just talking about, right, contract opportunities, if we start digging even deeper to what the awareness of requirements are, right? Now we have even more of a problem, and now it begins to snowball when we talk about a lack of awareness that really leads to a lack of readiness. And I get it because readiness can absolutely feel like it's a moving target, right? Again, we haven't even even on this webinar, we haven't even defined what readiness is. So how can you be ready for something that you aren't even aware of the definition or what it actually means? And then of course, if you haven't even taken the time to pursue and understand and measure your readiness before you pursue a contract, right? That's the time to do it, not after the fact. And then either you don't win and get no feedback, or even if you get feedback and say you weren't ready, and sometimes it's like, oh man, I could have actually fixed that. So if it's not happening in advance, that's where the issue is, and that's where all these five mistakes add up to fewer and fewer contracts that are actually being won. But that's why I'm excited to introduce the Scale Ready scorecard. As I said, we haven't talked about up until this point what it really means to be scale ready, if you will, right? What that readiness means. But through my research, through engaging with different best practice organizations, come up with a 3-minute diagnostic. Yes, 3 minutes, right? That is going to measure you across four key drivers, right? And basically, those key drivers are your connections, which we've talked about today, your competencies, your capacity, and capital, right? Four key major drivers. Now, there's a lot of detail up under each one of those, but those four key drivers will allow you to analyze, evaluate, and assess your own readiness, and then be able to do something about it. So with this scorecard, it's not only going to evaluate you, but it's going to give you some very specific next steps and recommendations based on how you scored. And so why take the scorecard? Again, is based on a proven model from industry best practice practitioners, supply chain decision makers, right? And as well as industry research about how do we help small businesses acquire more contracts, right? There's some key things and key aspects of your business that need to be improved, right? It aligns with real contracting success metrics. So we see the businesses that have actually won contracts, been able to move forward. They have these critical components of their business in place. And then again, with this scorecard, you're going to get some actionable next steps, right? That overall is going to reveal hidden gaps, identify priorities for your next 90 days, right? And then even benchmark you against other high performing companies. So all this information and insight, actually, there is no cost to you at all, other than maybe 3 minutes literally of your time. And so here's how it works. Take the scorecard. Only takes 3 minutes, right? Really quick. You'll receive an immediate readiness score, right? And there's basically three levels. It's going to measure you in these four areas. It's going to give you an overall score, but then also measure you in these four areas. And that's one of the things I talked about earlier is a lot of times we talk about readiness as one dimension, right? Or one perspective. But breaking this down into four, you actually can see your strengths and weaknesses in four different key areas of your business, right? That again gives you a snapshot. And then because your score is broken down to three levels per right assessment category, you're able to now get a personalized action plan that it's going to create for you based on how you scored and give you again some very specific next steps for how you can move forward from this point forward. So again, I'm excited to be able to offer this to you, launch it out. All you have to do is go to the website scale ready at scoreup.com, .scoreup.com, scoreup.com to get the insight, get the information, and to prepare yourself, right, for the contracting opportunities that you're talented for, right, that you have the skills, you have the abilities. And so oftentimes, as I said earlier, it's not a lack of skills, not a lack of talent. It's not a lack of the inability to do the work. It's all the other things that you're not ready for, and then other things that you're not aware of even that you need to be ready for. So this scale ready scorecard is going to allow you to understand those decision making factors that buyers are utilizing to assess and evaluate your business, even when you aren't even aware of it, even when you're not looking, so to speak, even when you don't understand how they're evaluating you other than just your price, right? Other than just right your social media, if you will. These are some the key factors that are helping them make decisions. So again, if you have any questions, please reach out to me. You can go to paulwilsonglobal.com to get other insights and information, as well as connect. Also, you have the ability to you also have the ability to set up a discovery meeting. And so you can sign up and register for a free discovery session also on that website. So again, it's been great being here with you. Hope you are able to walk away with some critical insights, tools, and information that's going to help your business. And of course, I highly recommend that you take this scale ready scorecard literally will take you less than 3 minutes, but also give you some very valuable information that you can walk away with. All right. So with that, it's been great being with you. Make sure you share, like, and subscribe this workshop and this webinar with someone else so they can also become scale ready just like you. Talk to you soon. Thanks. Goodbye.